So this video is going to show you how to insert two different graphs with a simple X and a simple Y axes. The challenge for this graph is if I want to just make a graph of altitude and pressure with altitude on the X axis, I'm just going to click on altitude. I'm going to drag my mouse over to pressure, and I'm just going to drag down here and highlight it all. So I've highlighted that data. Now I'm just going to go to Insert Chart, or I could use that Chart Wizard button. And notice it says it always assumes, Excel by default will assume your X axis is always the first column. So it made altitude my X axis and pressure my Y axis. And if that's what I wanted, that would be totally fine. I'm just going to minimize that here, so we kind of have that as a reference. But notice again, my pressure data goes from 14.7, and when I go all down here, basically to 0, and my altitude goes from about 0 to 100. So it has formatted it correctly. However, what I want to do, and you'll see this in your notes section, is I want to actually put altitude on the Y-axis. So I'm going to do the same process, but it's a little bit more complicated now because I want to format it. And this is where it's super important to always read your axes and be aware of what you're doing. So I've highlighted the data. I'm going to go to Insert Chart, and it's going to look exactly the same. So actually, I will just minimize this one a little bit more here. Okay. So now this is the chart that I'm working on here. I'm going to go in here. In fact, I'm going to get rid of my picture for a moment. And I'm going to go in here. And for my x-axis, it says the x-axis is altitude. And I'm like, nope, I want that x-axis not to be altitude. I want it to be pressure. And then I want my series here to be altitude. So you'll notice now, what have I done? My altitude, I've changed, and the altitude is 0 to 100, and my pressure is 0 to 14. So that makes sense, except look at these labels. This is still saying altitude, and this is saying pressure. It will flip-flop the data, but it will not flip-flop the labels. So this is where you have to be super aware of what you're doing, and this is where go back and check your data. So again, I wanted altitude. Altitude goes from 0 here all the way to 100. And so in here, I need to go in and change this. In order to change this, I can come over here, okay? And my easiest way is those three dots, Edit Chart, and I'm going to go here to Customize Chart and Axis Titles. If I click on that arrow, I'm going to say my vertical axis here is altitude in kilometers, okay? And now it's going to change it for me. I'm now going to come back here and say my horizontal axis is this pressure in PSI. Then, and if I look back again, 14.7 to basically to 0, okay, that makes sense there. I'm probably are going to want to change my title. Very typically, they'll talk about when you do a versus title, it is your Y versus X is just the standard format. So I might want to change my title. Again, the three dots here, Edit Chart, and I'm going to customize Chart Title. And I'm just going to come up here, Chart Title, and I'm going to say how pressure changes as a function of altitude or something like that, or as altitude changes, okay? So that would be, again, different things. What's weird about doing it this way is typically the pressure is dependent on the altitude, and so we often would do altitude on the x-axis, but this is one of those things that's a little flip-flop because you'll see in the next graph we're going to make. So, but here, I could make, again, change my title. And again, I can flip the axes, but I need to make sure and be very careful that I do things correctly. I'm going to minimize this graph and put it here. And then the third graph I'm going to show you how to do is we're going to do the exact same thing we did here with altitude on the Y and pressure, but we're not going to do pressure on the X. We're going to do temperature. So to do this, I'm going to highlight altitude. I'm going to pull my mouse down. And then here's the thing. I let up, but I need to now skip this second column and come over here. So this is where you're going to hit your Windows key if you're on a PC, your Control key if you're on a Chromebook, or it's like your Command key if you're on a Macintosh. So I've highlighted that. Now I'm going to hit again that Control key. I'm going to hold it down, and now I'm going to click here on temperature. Notice altitude is still highlighted. I'm going to drag down, make sure it lines up, and you do the exact same amounts. And now I was able to highlight two separate columns that aren't right next to each other. I'm going to go back and insert a chart. And you'll notice it says it always assumes altitude. It always assumes the column furthest to the left is my x-axis. And I don't want that. I want it to be altitude to be on the y-axis. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select that I want altitude here. And then I'm going to change my series to temperature. So now I've changed my temperature and my altitude. So my altitude, my x-axis should be temperature. Sorry about that. And my series here, the data it's plotting is altitude. Okay. And it's now that makes sense. My altitude went up to 100, but again, it's saying temperature here. So I'm going to have to go into customize chart axes and change my horizontal axes here to temperature. And that was in degrees Celsius. And then my vertical axes into altitude. And this was in kilometers. Okay, so that's the important lesson with that. Now, the next thing you might look at is say, I don't really like that it has these points. And the reason it has these like random points here is you'll notice like temperature, I had 15 and then I have this negative 18. So it makes this big change essentially, but it doesn't have a lot of data points in the middle there. So what I can do is I can further customize this because I'm going to assume there's some trends. I'm going to go back to my edit chart. And in here, I have my chart and I have my way it's all lined up in here. And I'm going to go into customize. And when I customize, you're going to see. So when I customize in here, I'm going to go customize and I'm going to go into chart style. When I do chart style, so that was the one above chart and axes, chart style, I can click smooth, which kind of smooths things out. And then if I click plot null values, essentially what it's going to do is it's going to kind of estimate or make an assumption in there. And so you'll see now I have this because I've had very few points in here, but it kind of now filled this in and it goes back and forth. And if you look in your notes about like temperature versus altitude, you'll see a graph that looks more like this typically. And so that's why we wanted to flip-flop these, because this is what we're going to use, this graph for looking at like the troposphere, the stratosphere, the layers, and we want to start at ground level and then go up from there. So that's why we are doing this. And again, the last thing to always do a good job is to change my title. So again, I may change I come over here to my chart title and say like how temperature changes relative to altitude, okay, or something to that effect. All right. Again, notice I label and I put units, I put kilometers and degrees Celsius. It's often good to put those units up in the title there. So this is the basics of how you can create graphs of different graphs, how you can flip your axes around, and you always have to be aware, look at your data, does your graph make sense, and do that logic check. So that's kind of step one of, and again, a review of making graphs and then editing flipping the axes and then editing the labels for those.